Nobody ever stayed, Clara Whitfield said at the creek fence in the blue hour before sunrise, when the water was black and quick and the last of the spring snow still clung to the north faces of the San Juan peaks. She said it without crying, which was how the words did their deepest damage. She had one hand wrapped around the top rail, one boot sunk in mud to the ankle, and the kind of stillness a person learns only after too many departures. The man across from her stood with a saddle over one shoulder and river water drying in dark lines on his coat. His horse waited behind him with its head lowered, steam lifting from its back into the cold April air. He looked tired, not offended. That was what struck her. Most men, when told a hard truth, either argued with it or smiled as if they were too broad-minded to take offense. He did neither. He only shifted the weight of the saddle, studied the crooked rail between them, and answered in the same plain tone she had used. So I unpacked my saddle instead. The creek kept moving. The mountains watched. Two lives stood at a boundary and did not yet know whether they were arriving or leaving. Some promises do not begin as promises. They begin as work. In the spring of 1886, Clara Whitfield was 31 years old, widowed for 3 years, owner-in-law and in labor of 63 rocky acres 6 miles east of Durango along the Florida River, and tired in ways the body could not always name. Her husband, Caleb Whitfield, had been dead since the May runoff of 1883, when a wagon axle split on the bank road above a crossing and the river took him before the 2 men riding with him could pull him clear. Since then she had kept the place by selling eggs, butter, 2 steers a season, and the colts Caleb had once planned to raise into a proper line of ranch horses. She had 14 head left that year, 9 cows, 1 milk mule with a sour disposition, a mortgage note of $142 due in July, and a house that held together because she had learned how to make mending look like intention. The place had a cottonwood by the porch, a narrow kitchen that faced west and therefore lost its light too early, a north pasture fence that leaned like an old man, and a creek boundary that ran high every spring. People in town called her capable, which was often the word used when no one meant protected. Capability is a compliment that still leaves a woman carrying feed by herself. The stranger came into Clara's life on a Thursday instead of a Tuesday, which she noticed at once because she was a woman who counted disruptions the way other people counted blessings. A mare had gotten herself through the weakened north fence at dawn and led 2 yearlings straight toward the cottonwoods by the river, where fresh grass and bad footing made fools of strong animals. Clara was halfway across the pasture with a coil of rope over one arm when she saw a rider cutting in from the county road. Not fast, not showing off, simply taking the angle that would keep the lead mare from turning downhill. He sat a horse the way some men carry a pail of water. Nothing sloshed, nothing wasted. By the time Clara reached the washout, breathing hard and muddy to the knees, he had already turned the mare back and blocked the yearlings with his own horse's shoulder. He did not shout. He used pressure, silence, and good timing. 10 minutes later all 3 animals were contained against the broken stretch of fence, as if the trouble had been planned for his arrival. He dismounted, took off his hat, and said, "Looks like your posts gave up before your stock did." It was a sensible thing to say. She mistrusted him for being right. His name was Elias Mercer. He was 36, lean rather than broad, the sort of lean earned by weather and years on horseback, with sun-brown skin, dark brown hair worn a little longer at the collar than town fashion preferred, gray eyes that seemed lighter in bad weather, and a scar along his left jaw that only showed clearly when he turned into the light. He had a quiet mouth, large work-worn hands, and the habit of letting other people finish a thought before he decided what portion of it deserved an answer. His clothes were clean but traveled in. A dark wool hat with a plain band, a faded blue work shirt, a weathered brown vest, sturdy trail trousers, and a dust-marked coat that had seen more than one season on the road. His bay gelding, Juniper, stood steady beside him as if patience were a discipline they practiced together. Clara learned from the tag on his bedroll and the grease marks on his saddlebags that he had worked freight once, broken horses by contract, and drifted in a wide loop from Pueblo to Silverton to Mancos, taking whatever work asked more of the hands than of the tongue. She also learned, in the first hour, that he noticed things people usually missed. He saw the rot in the 3rd fence post before she pointed to it. He saw the hitch in her mare's back step. He saw the 2nd pail by the well and knew she was doing a 2-person place alone. She offered him water because refusing would have been ungrateful, and gratitude was one of the few luxuries she still insisted on affording herself. He drank on the porch steps, hat in his lap, and looked at the house with the respectful attention a carpenter might give a church that had survived hard winters. When he asked whether she needed help resetting the line before nightfall, he did not make the offer sound charitable. He made it sound practical. That, more than his competence, was what made Clara hesitate. Pity asks to be thanked. Help that comes dressed as common sense is harder to refuse. They worked the fence until the light went copper over the pasture, setting 5 new posts, digging out runoff damage, and stretching wire until her shoulders trembled. He never asked what had happened to her husband. He never asked whether there was another man nearby who usually handled the heavier work. He kept pace with her instead of trying to overtake her. At dusk, when she told him the nearest room for rent was Mrs. Pike's in town, and he glanced at the weather rolling over the ridge, she knew what he was considering before he spoke. There was a spare bunk in the loft above the tack room. There was also sense in not sending a wet rider 6 miles back on a road turning to ruts. She said, before he could ask, "You can have the loft for one night if you don't mind the draft." It should have ended there. But tired people sometimes say the truest thing in the room before they mean to, and Clara had lived too long among departures not to warn herself against hope. She looped the gate chain through her fingers and said, "It's best not to make a habit of this place. Nobody ever stayed." She intended it as a courtesy to herself more than to him, a way of making sure the room between them remained properly furnished with caution. Elias rested his saddle against the rail, not with drama but with care, as if every object deserved to be put down gently before a hard answer was given. Then he said, "So I unpacked my saddle instead." For a second she thought he was mocking her. But there was no edge in him, only fatigue and a kind of dry patience. What he meant, she realized, was that if a roof was offered and work was plenty and weather was turning mean, a sensible man could stop arguing with the horizon for a night and put his things where they might do some good. The line almost made her smile. Almost. She turned away first so he would not see that it had come close. The rain began after dark and held for 36 hours. By Saturday morning the north pasture had become a field of standing water, and a section of the creek boundary slumped inward where the bank had been gnawed soft by runoff. Elias could have ridden on as soon as the clouds lifted. Instead he was in the yard before Clara, carrying split rails from behind the barn and laying them in sorted stacks by length without needing to be told where the sound wood was kept. He found the shovel with the intact handle. He patched the ditch where it had broken near the lower kitchen garden. He noticed the mule's right rear shoe was loose and reset it between chores. By noon he had repaired the latch on the smokehouse door, the one Caleb had always meant to fix before winter and never had. He did not mention that he had done it. Clara noticed only when the door closed cleanly on its own for the first time in 2 years. Quiet competence has a way of appearing in a house before the person responsible for it takes up any real space in conversation. That was his first danger to her. Not charm, usefulness. Some people make themselves beloved by being vivid. Others do it by making your hard days run smoother until the thought of losing them begins to feel like damage. That is the more serious sort. On Tuesday she found herself driving to town with Elias on the wagon bench beside her because he had 6 horseshoes to sell and Mrs. Pike had asked whether the stranger with the gray eyes knew anything about mending a pump. The arrangement was ordinary enough to excuse itself. Even so, the road felt altered. Clara was used to traveling with silence as her sole companion, the Florida River to one side and the broken shoulders of the San Juans lifting blue in the distance. Elias did not crowd that silence. He sat with his hands loose over his knees and answered only what was asked. When she told him the names of the ranches they passed, he listened as if property lines and creek turns mattered. That too was rare. At Pike's Mercantile Thomas Hale came out to lift the egg crates from the wagon, and Clara watched the 2 men take each other's measure with the decent caution of people who had no wish to be foolish. Thomas was 33, clean-shaven, sandy-haired, straight-backed, and the kind of respectable that made mothers approve before daughters had formed an opinion. He ran feed accounts for his brother-in-law's store, owned a narrow parcel west of town, and had been speaking to Clara in steadily deepening circles since Christmas. Not pressing. Not embarrassing. Present. He touched the brim of his hat to her, nodded to Elias and said, "Looks like you hired sense." His first true labor gift came in the lower pasture after a windstorm tore 6 lengths of wire loose and sent one corner brace half out of the ground. Clara had intended to spend the better part of Friday on it, though a steady ache had settled behind her shoulders and she knew she would end the day angry at her own limits. Elias rode out before breakfast with the auger, the tamping bar, and a bundle of cedar stays. By the time she reached him with coffee in a lidded tin, he had stripped to his shirt despite the cold, planted 2 new posts 3 feet deep, and set them square enough to make the whole line stand straighter beyond the repair. Sweat had darkened the cloth down his spine. Mud clung to his boots to the ankle. He worked with the physical honesty of a man who understood that effort properly spent is its own kind of tenderness. He asked her to hold the wire while he levered the brace into place, and she watched the muscles in his forearms shake with strain he did not dramatize. When the final staple went in, the pasture line ran clean from the creek bend to the cottonwoods. He looked down at once, judged it sufficient, and only then took the coffee. Clara said, "You didn't need to do it all before I came out." Elias shrugged. "Needed doing before the ground softened." He sipped and handed back the tin. "You've got enough things on this place asking for your whole back." It was not a declaration. It landed harder than one. The second labor gift was quieter and therefore, to Clara, even more dangerous. Her kitchen window had been set badly years before, facing too far west so that the morning table never caught enough sun, and one lower pane rattled in every storm. Caleb had promised to change it come fall for 4 falls in a row. Clara had stopped noticing the disappointment by naming it weather. One Monday she returned from checking the upper spring and found Elias kneeling inside the kitchen with the old sash on the floor and a new frame laid out across 2 chairs. He had salvaged a better casing from the collapsed line shack near the south draw, cut it true, and was resetting the opening so that the light would hit the breadboard from the east. He looked up as if caught doing something nearly improper. "I should have asked before pulling the trim," he said. But the day held. Clara stared at the angle, at the wash of bright morning falling exactly where it had never reached before, at the care hidden inside the plainness of the act. "Why this window?" she asked. He wiped his thumb along the plain shavings on his trousers and answered, "Because you work in here before the sun crosses the house, and a room ought to meet a person where they are." Then, perhaps realizing the intimacy of what he had said, he bent back to the hinges. Clara turned to the stove under the pretense of lifting the kettle because if she looked at him any longer she might have to admit that care can become visible in wood before it becomes audible in speech. That is what love looks like when it does not announce itself. It just quietly faces east. The June stock sale in Durango brought buyers from as far as Pagosa and one cattleman up from Pueblo, who paid $54 for the chestnut filly after seeing her step under saddle with the softness Elias had trained into her. The second colt brought $49. After feed deductions, commission, and the percentage Clara had promised, she returned home with enough money to cover nearly half the banknote. Enough to breathe, not enough to rest. Thomas Hale found her by the wagon while she was tying down a sack of seed and offered, with grave courtesy, to carry the deposit to First Onimus himself since he was riding there in the morning. She let him because trust in one matter need not counterfeit any other. He walked beside her a moment after, boots loud on the boardwalk, and said, "Clara, I hope you know no one in town would think poorly of you if you chose what was stable." She stopped at that because the word had too many meanings to pass unexamined. "And what is stable?" she asked. Thomas met her gaze. "A roof that intends to remain a roof. A man with land in his own name. A future people can see from the outside." He was not insulting Elias. He was describing himself. That was the trouble. He did it gently. In the second week of June, Sheriff Holloway brought out a packet of tax notices and a piece of news that stiffened the whole supper table. The county planned to inspect unregistered water diversions along the smaller ranches before August. Clara's lower ditch was legal but poorly reinforced. If the bank failed under inspection or looked neglected, she could be fined more money than the season had any right to ask from her. "It isn't punishment," Nate said, though everyone present knew that bureaucracy often arrived wearing the face of fairness. It's more that they want it sound on paper and in earth. Elias asked 2 questions about bank slope and runoff angle, then pushed his plate back and went to fetch a lantern. Clara followed him to the porch. That can wait until morning, she said. He was already testing the wick. Maybe the fixing can, he replied. The worrying won't. They spent the next day bracing the lower ditch with stone and timber, cutting a spillway, and shoveling until their wrists throbbed. At sunset, with mud dried pale across both their sleeves, Clara laughed for the first time in his presence without checking herself halfway through. He looked at her as if he had been waiting for that sound longer than the calendar allowed. Some joy is not new. It is just finally witnessed. The confession Clara had not asked for came 3 days later beside the tack room, and because she had not asked, she believed it. A storm had rolled over the ridge and driven them inside early. Elias was rubbing down Juniper beneath the overhang when Clara handed him a clean cloth and noticed the small leather child strap hanging from the back of his saddle, polished by thumb and weather. She had seen it before and thought it some piece of rigging. "You keep that for luck?" she asked. He looked at the strap for a long second before answering. "No, then, because storms make honest rooms." He told her the rest in one plain burst, as if the facts had been waiting for weather. He had married at 23 in Pueblo, to a woman named Lena who laughed loudly enough to shame gloom out of a doorway. They had a daughter, May, who died at 4 during the fever summer of 1879. Lena followed before the leaves turned, not from the fever itself but from the weakness after it. Elias had been on a freight contract west of Cannon City when the sickness worsened. By the time he reached home, both graves were already marked. He finished the contract the next month because grief does not always make a man noble. Sometimes it just leaves him moving in the wrong direction because stopping would require understanding what has happened. Since then he had kept one small strap from May's riding toy because it was the only object worn smooth by her hands that the house had not already swallowed into memory. "I got used to leaving before people could expect me," he said. It felt simpler than being needed and failing it again. Clara did not reach for him. She understood too well the insult of being comforted too quickly. She only said, "That wasn't failing." He gave a short, disbelieving breath. "Maybe not. It looked enough like it from where I stood." Rain drummed the roof between them. Grief does not leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. July approached with heat pressed low over the fields and the sound of grasshoppers rising in the afternoon. The county inspector came on the 2nd day of the month, examined the lower ditch, kicked twice at the reinforced bank, and declared it adequate with the same lack of ceremony by which bad news and good news usually arrive in practical lives. Clara should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt the sharper unease of a person who knows one crisis has been replaced by another less visible one. Thomas Hale called that Sunday with a basket of peaches from a trader out of Grand Junction and news that First Onimus would accept the first half of her note without penalty if the remainder was paid by September 1st. He sat on the porch in his best summer coat, looking not handsome exactly but reassuring, and after the weather and the bank and Mrs. Pike's new porch plant had all been properly discussed, he said, "Clara, I won't insult you by pretending you do not know why I keep coming." She set down her mending. He folded his hands once before continuing. "I can offer steadiness. My parcel joins my brother-in-law's west field, and there's enough saved to clear your note before harvest. I respect what you've built. I would not ask you to become smaller inside my house than you are in your own." It was, by any reasonable measure, a good proposal in the making. That was why tears pricked unexpectedly behind her eyes. Goodness does not always arrive in the form the heart can use. The third labor gift came 2 mornings later, after 2 days in which they had spoken only in the clipped commerce of chores. At the edge of the cottonwood stood an old cedar tack chest Caleb had built in their first year, warped now by weather because Clara had moved it out of the house when grief made the sight of it too sharp. One hinge hung twisted. Inside lay a few useless things she could not throw away. Caleb's pocket knife with the bone handle, 2 letters tied in blue thread, a baby boot so small it fit in her palm. The boot had belonged not to a child she had raised, but to one she had lost at 5 months in the winter before Caleb died. A daughter who had never lived long enough to become known beyond the walls of the house. Elias had never asked about the tiny grave marker beside the cottonwood. She had never told him. On that morning she came back from the spring and found the chest sanded smooth, the split lid reset, the hinge replaced, and the interior lined with fresh oilcloth against damp. Elias was kneeling beside it with a tack hammer, careful as a man handling someone else's sorrow. He stood at once as if fearing he had trespassed. "The wood was good under the warp," he said. Clara could barely manage breath. "Why would you touch that?" He answered after a silence long enough to be respectful. "Because some things matter more when they've been left outside too long." She sat down on the porch step because her knees had stopped obeying her. He did not reach for her. He only carried the repaired chest into the house and set it by the wall where morning light from the new window would find it. Love sometimes arrives disguised as restoration. It makes room for grief without asking grief to move out. The public test arrived at the Founders' Picnic on July 17th, held in a cottonwood clearing south of town where tables were set with pies, cold ham, pickled beans, and lemonade diluted by the optimism of church women. The whole valley turned out. Children ran races. A fiddler played near the bandstand. Ruth Bell organized a three-legged contest with suspicious enthusiasm. Mrs. Pike observed all developments from the shade, as if she had founded the institution of public noticing herself. Clara came in a pale blue calico dress with long sleeves buttoned at the wrist, a high collar, and a straw hat tied beneath her chin. Elias arrived later after seeing to a lame gelding for Sheriff Holloway, wearing a clean vest and looking uncomfortable in garments that suggested society. Thomas Hale, who had likely chosen the day because public places make private questions harder to evade, asked Clara to walk with him to the creek table where prizes from the pie auction were displayed. He did not try to trap her. He only refused further postponement. "I mean to ask plainly," he said when they were far enough from the music to require quiet. "If I come to your house on Sunday with Reverend Coombs aware of my intention, will I be welcomed as a suitor or spared as a friend?" Across the clearing, Clara could feel the entire town attempting not to stare. External pressure does not always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like witnesses. She turned and saw Elias at the edge of the crowd, one hand on the fence post by the stock pen, expression unreadable from the distance. Mrs. Pike had gone perfectly still. Ruth Bell looked ready to throttle Providence itself if it mishandled the scene. Clara had always believed that decisive moments would announce themselves with thunder or certainty. Instead, this one came with fiddle music, paper plates, and a decent man asking for an answer he had earned the right to hear. She told Thomas the truth as far as she could bear it then. "If you come Sunday," she said, "you will be welcomed with respect. But I do not know if respect is the same as what you deserve." He took that in, hurt crossing his face not as outrage but as recognition. "No," he said after a moment, "it isn't." He did not raise his voice. He did not shame her. Yet for the first time there was friction in him, a line of self-protection drawn where dignity required it. "Clara, fairness matters to me. I have tried to be fair to your pace, your circumstances, your grief. But I won't become the safe answer to a question your heart is asking elsewhere." She closed her eyes briefly. He had seen too much. "Thomas," he lifted a hand. "I know." The generosity in that hurt more than accusation would have. He gave a small bow of the head. "Then I hope the man you want learns enough courage to deserve the room you've kept for him." And because he was, in fact, decent, he walked away before anyone could turn his disappointment into spectacle. When he heard her boots on the bank, he did not turn at once. "Hale deserved better than to be made a public lesson," he said. There was no bitterness in it. That almost made her angrier. "And so your answer is to leave?" she demanded. He faced her then, tiredness etched clear around his mouth. "My answer is not to stay where I might become one more man a decent woman cannot count on." The words struck too near the oldest bruise she carried. "Nobody ever stayed," she said again, the line sharp now, a weapon she had worn so long it had fitted itself to her hand. Elias looked at her with something like pain, or perhaps just exhausted honesty. "I know." He shifted the saddle down to the rail. "I heard you the first time." Wind moved through the willows. The creek worked past stones that had no say in being shaped by it. Clara stepped closer until the fence was the only thing between them. "Then why would you make yourself matter here?" she asked. "Why change the window? Why fix the chest? Why act like a man with roots if you meant to ride off as soon as the road dried?" His jaw tightened. When he answered, the restraint in him cost something. "Because staying a while and doing the work in front of me was the only courage I had. Because wanting more than that felt dangerous. Because I buried a wife and a child and spent 7 years learning how to leave before dawn so nobody would have to watch me fail at permanence." For once his calm frayed. "And because every day on this land made me want what I had no right to ask for." For a long moment the only sound was the creak. Then Elias laid the saddle down completely, both hands free at last. "All right," he said. "Fear, then." He stepped to the fence, close enough that the worn grain pressed against both of them. "Fear that if I stay, I'll start measuring days by your lamp in that east window and your boots on the porch and the way your horses settle when they hear your voice. Fear that if I belong somewhere again and lose it, I won't survive it with as much usefulness as the first time." Clara let the truth of that pass through her without dismissing it. "And fear on my side," she said, "that I'll believe you, and the place where I keep belief has already buried enough." The confession did not solve them. It simply removed the furniture they had been hiding behind. Elias looked past her toward the house, the repaired porch step, the ditch running true, the barn roof glowing faintly under the last light. When he spoke again, his voice had turned quieter, steadier. "You said nobody ever stayed." He gave the smallest rueful breath. "So I unpacked my saddle instead, Clara, because it was the closest I could come to staying without naming it and frightening us both." The line, heard there at the boundary between land and water, between caution and want, changed shape entirely. It was no longer a joke. It was a confession with calluses on its hands. By August 1st the remaining banknote was paid, partly by the second colt sale, partly by Clara's butter money and egg ledgers, partly by a 3-day contract Elias took breaking a pair of draft mules for a rancher near Bayfield and brought the earnings straight back to the kitchen table without ceremonial sacrifice attached to the gesture. "If this is to be a partnership," he said, "it ought to start by behaving like one." Clara looked from the stack of bills to the man who had set them down so matter-of-factly and understood that what she wanted was not rescue but mutuality. He did not save her place in the way Thomas might have saved it all at once by marrying economics to protection. He joined himself to the work of keeping it. There is a difference. One makes a person beholden, the other makes them less alone. They married in October after the first high-country frost silvered the grass and made breath visible at dawn. Not a grand wedding. A church service in Durango with Mrs. Pike crying into a handkerchief she claimed was for her cough. Ruth Bell standing up in a plum dress and refusing to let Clara pretend her hands were not shaking. Sheriff Holloway in a clean coat. And Thomas Hale present in the back pew because decent people do not vanish just because disappointment asked them to. Clara wore dark blue wool with long sleeves, a high collar, and her mother's brooch at the throat. Elias looked as uneasy with public attention as any groom ought to. When Reverend Coombs asked the necessary questions, their answers were so plain they almost sounded insufficient for the weight they carried. But afterward, outside beneath a sky clear enough to show every ridge line, Elias held her gloved hand with that same careful steadiness he had once used on frightened horses, and Clara knew plainness was not poverty. It was truth stripped of ornament. The town fed them ham, biscuits, preserves, and speculation. Mrs. Pike, toasting with coffee, declared that anyone surprised by the outcome had not been paying adequate attention. Ruth replied, which is to say, no one. Even Thomas laughed at that. Late that spring Clara and Elias walked the creek boundary at dusk, the same stretch where so much had once stood undecided. Snowmelt ran quick but not wild. Willows leafed fresh green. The repaired fence cast long bars of shadow across the bank. Clara stopped at the rail and touched the weathered top board with her fingertips. Elias came up beside her carrying nothing more dramatic than a coil of new wire for a section farther downstream. She looked at the water, then at the house beyond the pasture, then at the man beside her whose hat now hung nightly on the same peg by the door. "Do you remember what I said here the first time?" she asked. He smiled slightly. "I remember every word that mattered." Clara drew a breath that felt deep enough to reach the old rooms inside her, where fear had once lived like a tenant who never paid. "Nobody ever stayed," she said. This time the line did not sound like a verdict. It sounded like the name of a winter already survived. Elias lifted the coil of wire, glanced toward the house, and answered exactly as he had before, only now the words carried the warmth of a life proved true. "So I unpacked my saddle instead." She laughed, then cried a little, then laughed again because happiness, when it comes honestly, rarely manages dignity on the first try. If this story found you at the right hour, remember, love often arrives as steady work before it becomes speech. Thank you for riding with me. Until next time, keep riding. Next, ride with me into the story of the widowed postmistress who laughed when a one-armed ranch cook offered to build her a winter porch, until the first blizzard showed her why he measured everything twice.